Radio 4. The time is 10:15.
On the 6th of June 1944, the Allies landed on the beaches of Normandy. That evening, War Report was broadcast for the first time in the Home Service, following the 9 o'clock news.
War Report number 1, the story of D-Day. Throughout the day, the British Broadcasting Corporation has been telling the world that Allied forces have crossed the Channel into France. With every arm of the liberating forces went a BBC correspondent, and soon after the assault was launched, their reports began to come in.
This is Air Commodore Helmore calling. I hope you can hear me against the engine noise. I'm talking to you in mid-air from a Mitchell bomber. This is Invasion Day. It's just before dawn, and we're on our way over to the coast of France to bomb an important bridge behind the invasion beaches so that railways can't supply the enemy when our troops land. It's an extraordinary thing to be in this aeroplane, a tiny microcosm poised in space, looking down as history, probably in the few moments, will begin to unroll itself before my eyes.
War Report. In the first of two programs, Frank Gillard returns to the battlefields to tell the dramatic story of the BBC's coverage of the last year of the war.
We're just going into that target. I think I can see the flares now, the Pathfinder stuff ahead. We're getting up speed. I don't think I can talk to you while we're doing this job. I'm not a blinking hero. I don't think it's much good trying to do these flash running commentaries when you're doing a dive bombing attack on a bridge. We're right over the target. My God, there's some bloody nasty flak around this place. There's a very nasty flak, blasted. Never mind. I heard the bomb aimer say just now, go in and do your stuff. Righto. Oh, there they go. My God, what a lift. What a good lift up into the air. We feel much lighter now. There's a colossal splash on the left. We're banking around to see what's happened. There's a colossal lot of flame from these bombs. It's the most remarkable thing I've ever seen. Anyway, we dropped the stuff and I think we're going to make a break for it. The best thing is to get out of here.
The entire future of nations hung in the balance in those historic June days of 1944 as the forces of the Allies fought their way back into Europe. Never was news of war's progress more eagerly and anxiously awaited. The BBC realised its heavy responsibilities created by that insatiable yearning. As the Allied attack went in, radio correspondents with their microphones were there in the thick of the action, with the paratroops, in the gliders, with the battleships and the assault craft, and right on the beaches.
We're over the enemy coast now, and the run-in has started. 1 minute, 30 seconds, red light, green light, and out, get on, get out. Out fast into the cool night, out into the air over France. And we know that the dropping zone is obstructed. We're jumping, in fact, into fields covered with poles. But I hit my chute, and lower my kit bag, which suspends on the end of a 40-foot rope from my harness. And then the ground comes up to hit me, and I find myself in the middle of a cornfield. I look around, and even with a compass, I can't be quite sure where I am. And overhead, hundreds of parachutes and containers are coming down. The whole sky now is a fantastic chimera of lights and flak, and one plane gets hit and disintegrates wholesale, sprinkling a myriad of burning pieces all over the sky. The job of the unit with which I jumped was to occupy the area and prepare the way for gliders.
This is Chester Wilmot, broadcasting from a glider, bound for France and invasion. What kind of a welcome we'll get, I don't know. We can only wait and see. We've just passed over the coast of France, and all around us along the coast, ack fire is going up, away to the right, away off to the left. But in front of us, there's nothing coming up at all, except immediately over about half right, where there's a fair amount of crater streaming up from roughly the area where we're going to land. The moon is still hiding behind the clouds, but they've been pitching a fair amount of heavy stuff up away over near Le Havre, and where we've got a diversion going on with other bombers, and that has attracted most of their attention. I can see away on our right the river, which is our main guide for coming into the landing zone, which is on the left of the river. And there now I can see the the light which is to guide us in to our main landing zone.
Overhead, the thunderous roar of fortresses and liberators going in to blast the coast. On the horizon, flash after flash from the guns of the bombarding ships, the destroyers fairly close inshore, the cruisers right on the horizon astern of us, some 7 miles out or so, and we know that beyond them too are battleships firing their 15 and 16-inch guns against shore targets. In the nearer distance, all around us are crafts of every sort and kind. Within a few moments, the first tanks that lead the assault will be on the beaches and opening up with their guns. They're followed by other tanks that grapple with the sea wall, and then the assault goes in.
Hello, BBC. This is Colin Wills recording on board an infantry landing craft on June the 6th, 1944. This is the day and this is the hour. The sky is lightening over the coast of Europe as we go in. The sea is a glittering mass of silver, with all these craft of every kind moving across it, and the great battleships in the background blazing away at the shore. One could not imagine a more stupendous scene. All of these ships, all taking their various parts in this invasion. And now, other warships moving across our path are laying a smoke screen that is taking the place of the cloud which formerly lay over the water. All hands to beaching station. All hands to beaching station. That's the signal for our sailors on board this craft to get ready for the landing.
We drove into the beach, swinging rather broadside on in the wind and the waves, seeing the jets of smoke from bursting shells near us in the water and slightly further away on the beach itself. And suddenly, as we tried to get between two of these tripod defense systems of the Germans, our craft swung, we touched a mine, there was a very loud explosion, a sudden shudder in the whole craft, and water began pouring in. The ramp was lowered at once, and out of the barge drove the Bren gun carrier into about 5 feet of water, with the barge settling heavily in the meanwhile. Well, the Bren gun carrier somehow managed to get through it, and we followed wading ashore. We did see a great many barges in difficulties with these anti-tank screens, and we noticed that a number of them had struck mines, as ours had struck mines, but then we began to see that in fact the proportion which had got through was very much greater.
On such a June morning as this, grey, overcast, cold, I waded ashore from my own landing craft, up to the armpits in water, past the wrecked hulks of landing craft overturned, on fire, which had been knocked out in the initial landings, holding over my head my midget recorder, so-called midget, it weighed 40 pounds, wrapped up in my gas cape in case it got wet or damaged, and struggled towards the shore. And of course, inevitably, I tripped over some underwater obstacle and fell, and my midget recorder went under the water. I recovered it and got it ashore. The whole place was humming with activity. There were the bulldozers sweeping away the great festoons of barbed wire. There were the sappers at work all over the place, digging up the mines with which the beach was absolutely infested, collecting them together and exploding them to get rid of the blessed things. The other sappers were laying trackways so that the troops who were pouring ashore at the time and the vehicles coming off the landing craft could get right away from the beaches, which were vulnerable, and get away inland. And that was the scene here on these Normandy beaches when the Allies finally came back into Europe.
At 9:45 this morning, a statement by General Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force, was broadcast on all transmitters.
People of Western Europe, a landing was made this morning on the coast of France by troops of the Allied Expeditionary Force. This landing is part of the concerted United Nations plan for the liberation of Europe, made in conjunction with our great Russian allies.
Radio was the broadcasting medium of this war coverage. The age of television had not yet arrived. Through sound recordings, radio was to bring the authentic noise and pandemonium of battle, the voices of the fighting men and their great commanders, and the reports of observers and witnesses into every home, making war almost a first-hand universal experience as never before. The BBC's engineers had built for the Normandy landings a portable disc recorder, which, although it weighed 40 pounds and was pretty cumbersome, a correspondent could carry with him just on his own. Until direct transmission became possible, the records had to be sent back to England by air or by sea, by whatever RAF or naval courier could be found. The portable recorder was a little miracle, though it was undeniably fragile and unreliable.
The curé of this little Normandy church, 2 or 3 miles from Caen, wants me to say how sorry he is about these bells. His village has only just been liberated, and it's taken until yesterday to clean up the many German snipers left in hiding. When I asked the curé if we might record the bells of his church ringing in celebration of the village's freedom, he asked me to wait for a week, and this is why. They used to have a very lovely little carillon in this church. Only 3 bells, but they were very proud of it, and many of the villagers were expert bell ringers. But when the Allies freed the village, 3 German snipers hid in the square tower of the church, and for 2 nights they were very troublesome. At last they gave themselves up, but it was found that they had smashed the big bell of the carillon. Monsieur le Curé promised that if I would only wait a week, he would have the big bell repaired, and you could hear the full carillon. But he added that in any case, they were going to ring the remaining 2 bells at once this morning to celebrate our coming. And I thought that you would rather hear the bells now, even though the big one has been smashed by the Germans, to let you know that the people of Normandy are celebrating their liberation, that church bells are ringing, and the villagers are going to Mass to give thanks for their freedom.
Here in the Imperial War Museum in London, I'm back again after 40 years, sitting in Monti's caravan, just as it was in Normandy back in 1944. I remember that on June the 10th, 1944, Monti issued one of his famous orders of the day. Unfortunately, there was no means of broadcasting this in Monti's own voice because we had no recording, or I had no recording equipment whatever in Normandy. My own portable recorder was out of action. And I had to keep on saying to him, I'm terribly sorry, until I can get hold of a recording machine, it's impossible to get your message back in the voice to London. Then I ran into one of my colleagues who had a midget recorder that he said was working, and I got him to lend it to me for an hour, rushed straight off to this caravan, and Monti was there, and I said, at last, sir, we can record your order of the day. Terrific. So we sat down, and then I saw that even this recorder wasn't working. And he was very upset about this. He was very downcast. He desperately wanted the troops to hear his message in his own voice. And while we were sitting there together, I happened to see out of the corner of my eye that on his desk he had a telephone. And I said to him, you're not by any chance able to communicate directly with the War Office on that telephone, are you? And he said, yes, there's a radio telephone link through to London now, and I can talk to the War Office. So I said to him, would you mind if I spoke to the War Office? And he looked a bit astounded, but he said, well, I suppose so, if you want to, go ahead. So I picked up the telephone, and there was a click, and his operator at his own little switchboard outside said, sir. And I said, give me the War Office in London, please. There was a click. The next voice said, War Office. So I said, give me the BBC, please. So there was a click. The next voice said, BBC. And I said, this is Frank Gillard in Normandy. Give me the recording channels, please. Right, Mr. Gillard. Click. Next voice, recording. I said, this is Frank Gillard in Normandy. I've got General Montgomery here. I've got an urgent recording to make. Please give me a recording channel. Sorry, Mr. Gillard, they're all in use. And I said, well, too bad. One of them will have to be interrupted. Then he came back on the line and said, it's all clear, Mr. Gillard. And do you know, in less than 30 minutes, Monti was coming over the air from the BBC in London to all the troops in Normandy.
I want personally to congratulate every officer and man in the Allied armies on the splendid results of the last 4 days. British, Canadian, and American soldiers, fighting gallantly side by side, have achieved a great success and have placed themselves in a good position from which to exploit this success. To every officer and man, whatever may be his rank or employment, I send my grateful thanks and my best wishes for the future. Much yet remains to be done, but together, you and I, we will do it, and we will see this thing through to the end.
Here in this small field just behind the main street of Creilly, surrounded now in 1985 by modern bungalows and small houses, is the site where we established our first transmitter on liberated soil, our transmitter MCO, which the engineers called Mike Charlie Oboe. It arrived here in a 3-ton truck with all its equipment, and the BBC had provided us with a tent as a studio, so we rigged up the tent. And we came to do our first transmission from here and found, of course, that the noise of gunfire and the noise of aircraft were so great, and the tent was quite incapable of keeping out this sound, that we simply could not operate from here. We had to go off and find ourselves a studio. Today, after 40 years, I've climbed once again the winding stone stairway up the tower of this Norman chateau in the village of Creilly, just 5 miles in from the coast, to the turret room, which we converted into the first broadcasting studio on liberated soil. And the studio has been preserved as a sort of broadcasting museum. On the walls are the memorabilia and the photographs of the people who were concerned in that operation. And an inscription says, this studio was in direct communication with the BBC in London. Through the BBC, the words spoken into the microphones here linked untold millions of listeners in France, in Britain, and in more distant lands with the historic struggle which culminated in a great and decisive Allied victory.
After you started broadcasting from Creilly, nobody, or very few people, I suppose, realized that the war correspondents were on the spot and were actually broadcasting from Creilly itself. And there was a man who was only 30 meters further away. From his house he could see your tower, but he never realized what he heard on the BBC came from so close.
With MCO, in came a small fleet of fully equipped BBC recording trucks and a detachment of engineering colleagues who, with devoted skill, were to share in all the vicissitudes of war with us and deal effectively with all our technical problems. We had no further need of couriers. Through MCO, we were continuously linked to London by radio. Once they'd been censored, the eyewitness dispatches of correspondents and their battlefield recordings could be transmitted direct from our studio to be received and re-recorded in London. Live broadcasts became frequent. London could say, over to Normandy, and off we would go. Listeners at home found it reassuring and comforting that so much broadcasting normality could quickly be established in the heart of a battle area. Reports, dispatches, and battlefront recordings poured back, hour by hour, day and night, in many languages, for the radio correspondents of all the Allies used our studio. The BBC directed our material into its frequent news bulletins and magazines for home and world listeners, and War Report every evening following the 9 o'clock news gathered together for a vast audience a compilation of the day's output from the fighting fronts.
Hello BBC, this is Frank Gillard here, recording just outside Tilly, a mile or two back from Tilly, on Friday morning, June the 16th, during a barrage which is being laid down to prepare the way for an infantry attack on a small village just to the east of Tilly. In this barrage, we've got our 4.2-inch mortars, our field guns, our medium guns, all the guns of the fleet. The shells are whistling overhead now, just listen to them. I'm not certain if you can hear that high-pitched whistle. The whistle of the shell that actually fits through the trees overhead here. I'm lying down at full length here in the cornfield. Just in the hedges around me, I can see many men taking shelter behind the banks, wearing their steel helmets, while this terrific barrage goes on around us.
Hello, BBC. This is Chester Wilmot broadcasting from a position just above the little village of Chert, about halfway between Tilly-sur-Seine and Caen. Last night, this village was in German hands. Today, we hold it. And from this village tonight, we're putting in a further counterattack to carry deeper into enemy territory the spearhead which was thrust down between Caen and Tilly-sur-Seine yesterday morning and was carried further today.
Our infantry have advanced across the open cornfield and into the wood. The artillery is putting down a concentration behind the wood, and one of our tanks over on my right has just fired a couple of rounds 250 yards from where I am. Further over to the left, I can see streams of tracers still cutting into the wood over the heads of the advancing troops, and the concentration of artillery going down on the far side of the wood is intensifying every moment. There you can hear machine guns firing from the hedgerow about a couple of 100 yards up from where I am. But there's so much smoke and dust rising from the cornfield that it's impossible to see where our infantry have got to.
The road into Tilly is a road of devastation. It was a ghastly, a sickening sight. I've never seen a place so completely obliterated. Tilly has just ceased to exist. Every house, every building is just absolutely, utterly a ruin. There's nothing left of this town but jagged, blackened walls and heaps of smoldering rubble. There was a horrible reek of death and destruction. The bodies were lying there in the ruins and along the roadside, terrible to look at, some of them with the flesh burnt from their bones. This was war in its most appalling form. It was death to touch anything there in Tilly this morning. We walked to the top of the street. The way was barred by a strip of white tape stretched right across the roadway. It bore a notice, mines. We looked out of Tilly down the long straight road to the south. It was death-ridden, empty, deserted. Half a mile down there, the Germans were waiting.
Often the British and Canadian fighting men of 21st Army Group in France told their own stories, recorded actually in the line or while they were resting in the rear areas.
Once in the middle of town, we split. One company went to the right and one to the left. Through the building, clearing them out one by one, throwing the jerrys out the windows, throwing hand grenades in the doors, throwing them back and forth over hedgerows and over the back lots, fighting our way through until we managed to reach each end of the town. One end of the town, there are two bridges. There, one of the companies remained and held those two bridges despite 3 counterattacks that night and early the next morning. We're now holding the town. We have the exits all well taken care of. If Jerry wants to try again, let him come. We're ready for him.
On putting the glasses to my eyes, I suddenly discovered it was a Tiger, a German Mark 6. I fired one round at it, at which the tank burst into flames. None of the crew came out, so I shoved another round into it. 2 of the crew jumped out, and just to make certain, I shoved a third round into it, and that finished off the tank. Well, just yesterday, when I was passing along the same road, I had the opportunity to see the marksmanship of my number 1. I discovered that both shots had been together. They were touching on the turret, and the third shot was just 6 inches below.
American Army signals brought in a transmitter, JESQ, Jig Easy Sugar Queen as the engineers called it, on our western front, linked to the BBC in London, so that radio correspondents could report direct from the Cherbourg Peninsula.
Hello, BBC. This is Colin Wills recording in the air over the Cherbourg battlefield. Below me, I can see the blackened scars of the battle and the pitted craters of the great bombardment which preceded our attack. Ahead of me lies Cherbourg. I can see it through the haze of smoke which rises from all around the battlefield. I can see clearly the German positions where guns are firing. Away up towards Cherbourg itself, there is a great fire raging somewhere on the east of the city, and I can distinctly see the line of smoke puffs from the guns and from the fighting below.
This is Larry Lasser speaking direct from Cherbourg. French refugees are slowly coming back, dressed in odds and ends of clothing and carrying knapsacks and cardboard suitcases. The Cherbourg women are an odd and pathetic sight. grimy and hollow-eyed. They wear the best clothes they own because they wanted to be sure to have at least those when they were evicted by German order 10 days ago. These Cherbourg women passed by our soldiers without looking at them. Apparently, they cultivated the habit of ignoring their German conquerors for so long, 4 years to be exact, that they regard any soldier as an interloper. And I cannot say that our American shock troops invite sentimental glances. After fighting their way from the beaches to Cherbourg in 3 weeks, wading through lines of German pillboxes on the way, the Americans have a hard, grim set to their unshaven faces. They look just as tough as they are, with grenades dangling from their belts and with machine gun posts on every street corner.
Every report and every recording had to carry the censor's stamp of approval before it could be put out. Censorship was obligatory. And because radio transmissions reached the enemy instantaneously, and we knew the Germans monitored every word we uttered, our material was particularly closely scrutinized. To a degree, we became self-censors, recognizing in advance the no-go areas where broadcast information might put our men's lives at risk. Quite soon, a specialist group of censors was actually attached to our BBC unit, so that we could discuss our material with them and get it on the air without delay in approved form. They were reasonable people in the circumstances, and they allowed us all the latitude their discretion would permit. There was no easy reporting from the Normandy bridgehead, no quick successes or rapid advances. With the technical help of our engineering colleagues, we chronicled in sound the bitter campaign of attrition stage by stage, and then on the 32nd day, our troops at last broke into the great strategic centre of Caen, the capital of Calvados, where the huge abbey church of Saint-Étienne stood largely intact amid the ocean of rubble and ruins of the ancient city. I've come back again, after more than 40 years, to this great church of Saint-Étienne, standing here in the approaches to Caen, which has such great memories for me, because on the 9th of July, 1944, the day when finally we drove the Germans back and we were able to get into this city, inside this great church were packed something like 2,000 men, women and children who'd come here for refuge. There was the great tradition in Caen that as long as the twin spires of Saint-Étienne stood, the British crown would remain. They had great faith in this story. They had great faith in the strength of the walls and the structure of this massive building. They had great faith in God, and they believed that as long as they were in this place, they would be safe. In this great church, where William the Conqueror lies buried, and safe they were, but they'd had to live here. They'd had to live here under indescribable conditions for more than a month. Here was their bedding all over the place, their cooking utensils, children running around. The stench of the place was almost unbearable, and yet they were all overjoyed because the moment of liberation had come, and they all wanted to send out a message of liberation to the world. And I just held up my microphone, and I let them give that message in the only way they could. They sang their great national anthem.
Allons enfants de la patrie, le jour de gloire est arrivé. Contre nous de la tyrannie.
The BBC meant everything to us, you know. It was the link with the free world. During the battle, it was the only way to hear what was really happening. And during the German occupation, of course, it was a great help to French resistance. Of course, we knew about war reports on the BBC at 9 o'clock every evening. We knew the names of some of the war reporters. It was absolutely wonderful when we saw on the 9th of July, when with the first soldiers liberating Caen, Frank Gillard, who appeared to us like the ambassador of freedom, and soon afterwards we could hear again on the BBC Chester Wilmot, Howard Marshall, names which were very familiar to us, and it was just like a dream seeing the real people arriving in front of us. Caen was just chaos. The city was just a heap of ruins. Many a time, of course, we were hungry during the battle, but at last we were free, and that was the most wonderful feeling that we could ever feel, and I must say that that was the most wonderful day in my whole life. It was forbidden to keep a wireless set, so I had to build a small crystal set, and lucky enough, the wavelength I got was not jammed, because the Germans jammed the other wavelength, and it was very clear, and I could hear, and then 3 times a day I would connect the earphones with the crystal itself. And my father wasn't always too keen about it, because he always said, you will get us all shot.
That was André Heinz, a fervent French admirer of everything British, most of all the BBC. He and I have been good friends ever since Caen's Liberation Day. Our job in Normandy was to provide the raw material for the BBC's news programmes. In Broadcasting House London, editorial teams assembled it for broadcasting. The War Report team, editors, producers, writers to provide the linking scripts, studio managers, engineers, secretaries, worked in shifts in a large underground room with a studio nearby. Michael Barsley was one of the writers.
And there was a sort of receiver at one end in which everything poured through from the beachhead, messages one after the other. The voice used to thunder forth all the time with hello anybody, and we would listen to the dispatches coming through and mentally make a note as to whether they were relevant, whether we needed them tonight, whether they'd hold, and so on. And then there were writers who used to bash around with the scripts and edit them, including one marvellous American girl, Bridget Myers, who was the kind of foster mother to our crew, and used to say, there, don't worry, and my God, I'm hungry, let's go and have something to eat.
We'd been told by the BBC higher-ups never to go out to lunch together, because that must have been in the depths of the V1s, I think. Well, V1s and then V2s. But of course we always did. We were all very close friends, and we enjoyed our little expedition to the upper air, and we would go to some local restaurant near Broadcasting House. And I must say, we were never bombed, of course, and nobody ever said a word about it.
We'd know by about noon or lunchtime what stuff was likely to come in, what was scheduled to come in, and the famous blackboard would then be put to use, and we put up Gillard, and we put up Chester Wilmot query, or we put up Alan Melville, whoever it might be that was liable to come through, and a possible duration. And then by the afternoon, we'd come to an idea of what sort of a program we could expect.
And the 2 writers would put their heads together, and having decided on the order in which the items would be broadcast, they would then write the links between them and the introductory material to each dispatch, identifying the name of the person, what branch of the service he was with, what the action was on the ground or in the air or wherever it might be. And then we would sit back and say, well, that's lovely. Now we've got it all tied up. And then, of course, something would happen, and it wasn't tied up at all, and a new story would come in.
And then, of course, the whole programme had to be rearranged and new links written, everyone working all out against the clock.
The paper would be snatched out of your hand, and as you sank your head in your hands, the girl, it's probably one of the lay girls, would rush it into the studio, actually into the studio, while John Snag was live on the air. He wouldn't look up, he'd just raise a hand for it, and you'd silently put into his hand, he'd put it in front of him, and when the cue came, he'd read it out as if he'd known it all the time. He'd never seen it before.
And now you want to know about the soldiers, the men whose feet now tread the soil of France. Howard Marshall landed with the Allied forces on the beaches. I'm glad to say that
it became as popular, I think, War Report, as almost as a variety show. I think one reason was that it was short, but it was packed with material.
Here at the foot of the hill, from the 13th century Norman chateau where we had our studio, was another chateau, and it's from the grounds of this chateau, which I'm looking out on now, that we broadcast on a Sunday morning in July 1944 a full religious service. We had been asked to assemble representatives of every fighting unit in the Allied lines, and they came in their hundreds. Montgomery himself read the lesson, the chaplain general to the forces preached the sermon, and it seemed that the whole of Britain was joining with us.
This is Frank Gillard on the front southeast of Falaise. 5 miles from Argentan, we turned off the road northeast along a country lane. This had been one of the German escape lines through the gap. Now it's just a graveyard of German equipment and troops. Guns and tanks and trucks and armoured cars and staff cars and amphibious cars and wooden carts loaded up with ammunition, with stores and with food, all utterly and completely smashed up. You could see where motor engines had been wrenched from their bearings by the force of the explosions and hurled 20 and 30 yards. Panther tanks had their turrets shorn clean off. The hull of the tank would be on one side of the road and the turret on the other. That's what a rocket-firing Typhoon can do. And through it all, our own troops were going forward on foot to continue the chase. Many of them were singing, shouting, whistling, laughing as they came down the road in the rain.
The German armies in northwest France have suffered a decisive defeat. The destruction of enemy personnel and equipment in and about the so-called Normandy pocket has been terrific, and it is still going on. Any enemy units that manage to get away will not be in a fit condition to fight again for months. There are still many surprises in store for the fleeing remnants. The victory has been definite, complete, and decisive.
With that complete and overwhelming defeat of the German 7th Army in Normandy, the radio reporters turned to the great breakout of the Allied forces and joined the historic dash for Paris.
Everywhere we came, there were crowds of people lining the streets. This division had to fight its way in. It was held up outside the city by some strong German resistance. We fought all yesterday afternoon, broke through the crust of defenses that the Germans had flung around Paris, ended this morning, but it wasn't an easy entry. We came in, and in spite of the cheering crowds and the work the French resistance troops have been doing here, we came in and we've had several street fights. 3 or 4 times our column has been held up, and we've had to clean up German strong points in the city itself. As many as 40 or 50 Germans holding out with machine guns in various buildings and sweeping the route along which we passed. But now we hope that's all over. We've just had a big fight here in the square in front of Notre Dame, and we're all lying on our stomachs and hoping for the best, but we hope that's all over now, and that these bells that we hear are a sign that the last German resistance in Paris is cleaned up.
Hello, BBC. Hello, BBC. This is Robert Dunnett, recording in Paris on Saturday, August 26th. I'm standing on the top of our recording car in the packed Place de la Concorde. Thousands and thousands of French people under this bright sunshine, and all the girls in their bright dresses, the men, most of them with their coats off, a colorful crowd, red, white, blue, and General de Gaulle. General de Gaulle following the police, following the tanks, walking down the Champs-Élysées, entering the Place de la Concorde now.
The general has now turned to face the square in this huge crowd of Parisians. He's being presented to people. He's being received. He's being received. Even while the general is marching into the cathedral. Well, that was one of the most dramatic scenes I've ever seen. Just as General de Gaulle was about to enter the Cathedral of Notre Dame, firing started all over the place. I was overwhelmed by a rush of people who were trying to seek shelter, and my cable parted from my microphone. But I fell just near General de Gaulle. He walked straight ahead into what appeared to me to be a hail of fire from somewhere inside the cathedral, somewhere from the galleries up near the vaulted roof. But he went straight ahead without hesitation, his shoulders flung back, and walked right down the central aisle, even while the bullets were pouring around him. Heaven knows how they missed him, but they were firing the whole time. There were blinding flashes inside the cathedral. There were pieces of stone ricocheting around the place. But Paris had come to celebrate the solemn Te Deum Mass, and it did.
While American and French forces celebrated in Paris, Montgomery's army group in the northern sector, with BBC recording trucks well up in the lead, headed for Brussels.
Hello, BBC. This is Chester Wilmot, broadcasting from a street on the outskirts of Brussels. A street fight is just going on as we're coming into the outskirts of the city, and the tanks about 2 yards away from me are swinging their turrets round to fire out over the open fields towards the wood where we believe there are some Germans, because from that wood has been coming some fire. About 10 yards in front of me, there is an armoured car which has just been firing into the wood. That was the machine gun fire which you heard at the opening of this broadcast. Right along the column, the road is absolutely jam-packed with tanks, ambulances, jeeps, trucks, armoured cars, and every kind of vehicle as this column streams into Brussels.
Hello, BBC. Hello, BBC. This is Stuart McPherson reporting from Brussels, Belgium. We drove in here just a few moments ago on this Monday morning, September the 4th, and I have never in all my life seen people so absolutely stark, raving mad with nothing but joy. I'm speaking to you from the Place du Brocaire. It's right in the center of the capital, and as far as the eye can see, there's just no pavement at all. It's just one black carpet of humanity. All the office buildings around are covered in the yellow, red, and black of the Belgian flag, ribbons. All the young ladies have rosettes and hair ribbons of the national colors. And to get protection, we've just had to get up on the roof of the van because there's no holding a microphone anywhere near any of these people. They just mob you. And all around, everywhere you look, no matter where you look, flags of the Old Glory, Union Jack, the Belgian flag, the red flag of Russia. It's an absolute maze of color. Well, that's the scene here in Brussels. It's just joy unrestrained.
The first great phase of the campaign in Western Europe had ended in total victory for the Allies. Through radio, BBC listeners in Britain and around the world had shared in the momentous experiences of those 13 historic weeks right up to the triumphant rejoicing in two major European capitals. All the preparation and planning for BBC war reporting had worked out pretty well. And what now? Would the European war be over by Christmas, as most people expected, and the armies fervently hoped? That indeed was to be another story.
War Report was written and presented by Frank Gillard. The correspondents were Guy Byam, Robert Dunnett, Larry Lasser, Howard Marshall, Stuart McPherson, Robert Reed, Michael Standing, Colin Wills, and Chester Wilmot. The programme was produced in Bristol by John Knight.
Frank Gillard continues his story at the same time next Sunday.